Welcome back to Literature Guide. Here is a new video for you about Kailyard School and Dymock poets. The term Kailyard literally means a cabbage patch in the backyard of a village house. The Kailyard School was a group of Scottish writers in the last decade of the 19th century. This group comprised some famous writers such as James Barrie, Ian Maclaren, S.R. Crockett. This group was criticized by George Douglas Brown in his novel. The Kailyard writers produced their literary works with romantic and idyllic settings, and they depicted manners and life of the rural rustics in realistic vein. They also employed Scottish dialect in their works. The group of Dymock poets comprised some famous writers such as Rupert Brooke, John Drinkwater, Robert Frost, Wilfrid Wilson Gibson, and Edward Thomas. It is really interesting to see the great American writer Robert Frost in this group. When he visited England in 1911, he produced 2 volumes of poetry in England that made him famous in England. This was a group of poets who resided in Dymock village near Gloucestershire. They depicted landscapes and scenery of English countryside and expressed their love for nature. A few writers of this group were associated with Georgian poetry. This group of Dymock poets had a mouthpiece in a quarterly poetry magazine, New Numbers, which was founded by Wilfrid Wilson Gibson in 1912. The literary works of Dymock poets were published in the New Numbers. I have tried my level best to cater useful information to the viewers. If you really like the videos produced by this channel, do like and subscribe Literature Guide. Let's dive into the video and enjoy the video.
Kailyard School and Dymock poets. In the last decade of the 19th century, a group of Scottish writers depicted the manners and life of Scottish peasantry with realistic touch. Their novels were tinged with sentiment and humour in Scottish dialects. This group of novelists is known as Kailyard School. The major Scottish writers of this group were James Matthew Barrie, Ian Maclaren, Samuel Rutherford Crockett, and George Douglas Brown. The novelists of the Kailyard School produced their novels with romantic and idyllic settings. The term Kailyard literally means a small cabbage patch at the back of a village house. But why it should be called the Kailyard School is still a mystery. The term was first employed by J.M. Miller in an article in his book of short stories called Beside the Bonny Briar in 1894. Ian Maclaren has alluded to the Jacobite song There Grows a Bonny Briar Bush in Our Kailyard. James Matthew Barrie produced Scot dialect stories Auld Licht Idylls and A Window in Thrums, which present simple village life of the rural rustics. James Barrie's A Window in Thrums is based on his hometown of Kirriemuir. S.R. Crockett belonged to the Kailyard School of novelists. He produced some remarkable works such as Mad Sir Uchted Off Hills, The Black Douglas, The Stickit Minister and Some Common Men, and The Lilac Sunbonnet. George Douglas Brown bitterly criticised the Kailyard idyls of Scottish village life in his novel, The House with the Green Shutters. The novel is set in a fictitious town Barby which resembled to his village of Ochiltree. The novel deals with the rise and fall of John Gourlay, a tyrannical businessman, and his inability to adapt to changes. The novel The House with the Green Shutters makes the readers recall Thomas Hardy's novel The Mayor of Casterbridge and Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Weir of Hermiston. The term Dymock poets has been applied to a group of poets of the 20th century who dwelt in Dymock village from 1911 to 1914 in Gloucestershire for some time. These Dymock poets adhered to traditional forms and techniques of English poetry. They derived pleasure in depicting scenes and landscapes of English countryside, the life of rural rustics, and real situations. The chief members of this group of Dymock poets were Rupert Brooke, Robert Frost, John Drinkwater, Wilfrid Wilson Gibson, Edward Thomas, and Lascelles Abercrombie. The Dymock poets expressed their thoughts in the short-lived poetry magazine New Numbers. It was a quarterly poetry magazine founded by Wilfrid Wilson Gibson along with the other Dymock poets in 1912. Rupert Brooke, one of the chief members of the Dymock poets, produced war sonnets in 1914. His famous war sonnets, The Soldier and Peace, appeared in the New Numbers in 1914. These war sonnets earn name and fame for the poet. Rupert Brooke's famous poem, The Old Vicarage, Grantchester, depicted life in the village where he dwelt in 1911. The poem was published posthumously in 1914. The poem The Old Vicarage, Grantchester has been written in simple and lucid style and in colloquial vein. Lascelles Abercrombie also contributed to the 4 issues of a quarterly poetry magazine New Numbers in 1914. He had great fascination for the metaphysical poetry. He composed interludes and poems in 1908 and emblems of love designed in several discourses in 1912. Lascelles Abercrombie was a gifted writer with a fine rhythmic sense. He adroitly handled various topics in his works. His plays Deborah, Ada appeared in 1913 and The End of the World in 1914, which reflect his keen interest in character study. John Drinkwater, a poet, critic, dramatist and actor, was one of the members of the group of Dymock poets. His poetry appeared in the quarterly, New Numbers in 1914. John Drinkwater produced 9 volumes of poetry which comprised Swords and Ploughshares, Oulton Pools, Tides and Summer Harvest. Wilfrid Wilson Gibson founded the poetry magazine New Numbers but survived for a short period. His poetry deals with northern countryside themes. It is interesting to note that Robert Frost was associated with the Dymock poets. When he visited England in 1912, he published his first volumes of poetry, A Boy's Will in 1913 and North of Boston in 1914, which made him famous in England. Robert Frost's 2 famous poems Mending Wall and The Death of the Hired Man appeared in North of Boston. Like the other Dymock poets, Robert Frost composed his verse in traditional style about countryside, landscapes, people, and real situations. As the Dymock poets were associated with the Georgian poetry, their literature reflected love of nature, quest for simplicity and reality, and their adherence to forms and techniques of the English poetry like the Georgian poets. It is important to note that these Dymock poets were associated with the Georgian poets and they were affiliated to the periodical Westminster Gazette.
How is the video? I hope you liked this video. I have already produced many useful and informative videos for you on this channel. If you visit this channel, you can have useful and informative information on this channel in the form of videos. You can have useful information for the competitive exams on this channel, Literature Guide. If you have any suggestions and views, you can put your comment in the comment box below and express your views and suggestions. I will try my level best to make changes according to your suggestions and views. I will meet you soon with a new and interesting topic of English literature. Meet you.
Please subscribe Literature Guide.